Oh, hi, welcome back. So, I'm looking at an article where I'm actually going to give Joe Biden more praise. I'm actually surprised, given that I'm a leftist, and I didn't expect a neoliberal to be doing as well as he's doing at the beginning, at least. I mean, we kind of expected it, but not this well. Um, Granted, he has had problems when it comes to foreign policy. He's incredibly hawkish, and I'm against it in the war in the Middle East. But in the meantime, I'm looking at an article from CNBC that's um, that's titled "Biden Orders DOJ to End Private Prison Contracts as Part of Racial Equity Push." So this is more executive orders that Joe Biden has signed. The beginning of it, the key points. President Joe Biden ordered his Department of Justice not to renew its contracts with private prisons, one of multiple new planks of Biden's broad focused racial justice agenda. This is great. Honestly, this is great. I'm highly against private prisons. Granted, this doesn't focus on ICE. I'm going to get more into that later. Um, let's see. Another point, it was one of four new executive actions after Biden laid out his racial equity plan. Third point, the actions are aimed at combating discriminatory housing practices, reforming the prison system, respecting sovereignty of tribal governments, and fighting xenophobia against Asian Americans, especially in light of the COVID pandemic. It's a good call, considering it's been used rhetorically as the Chinese virus by Donald Trump, which has been extremely dangerous and has targeted Asian Americans. It's been a giant dog whistle. I'm not saying it's anyone who's Chinese and it's their fault. That's not what I'm saying. But it was from China. Anyway, China. Yeah, it's been incredibly disgusting and bigoted and xenophobic rhetoric. Department of Justice Tuesday to phase out its contracts with private. So it's to phase out its contracts with private prisons. So nothing's been signed. It could still happen technically, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen. Considering Joe Biden platformed this big time. Signed four executive orders laying out racial equity at the White House. So these are supposed to combat everything that I said. He said, and Biden said, "quote I ran for president because I believe we're in a battle for the soul of this nation." I don't know what that means, but okay. Um, and the simple truth is, our soul will be troubled as long as systemic racism is allowed to persist. So this is also the guy who wrote the 1994 crime bill, which incarcerated many more minorities. But I'm at least glad he's taking action to hopefully rectify those actions. But it doesn't help the people who have been imprisoned for nonviolent drug offenses. But at least something is changing, even though we went backwards in the 90s in terms of the drug war. Quote, I firmly believe the nation is ready to change, but government has to change as well. Well, that's why you're in office, Joe Biden. That's why you were elected as the President of the United States, and you won the popular vote by 7 million votes, so you better fucking do something, bud. And it looks like you are, so I'm going to give you credit. Joe Biden, who's not listening to me. So, actions are the latest sweeping first week flex of presidential powers. Here's what Biden signed Tuesday afternoon, according to a preview provided by senior administration officials. First, an executive order directing Biden's attorney general not to renew Department of Justice contracts with privately operated criminal detention facilities. Fantastic. I love this. I love this so much. Because private prisons are objectively terrible. They're objectively terrible. You're putting the free market into something that the free market shouldn't be in, which is prisons, especially because they're not regulated enough as it is, and not to mention, they essentially make profit off of slave labor. So it's just a business, which is why you'll see a lot of private prisons also lobby for being in positions such as anti-marijuana, anti-drugs. They profit off the drug war, and it just happens to mostly target minorities per capita, at least. Like if you look at the percentages compared to population between minorities and white people, black people are incarcerated way more than white people, even though there's a smaller population of black people. Number 2, a presidential memorandum directing the Department of Housing and Urban Development to examine the effects of the Trump administration's regulatory actions that, quote, undermine fair housing policies and laws, unquote. Based on that analysis, the memo also directs HUD to take steps to fully implement housing early development, if you don't know what the HUD is, to steps to fully implement the requirements of the Fair Housing Act. Cool. Pretty good. So that way redlining can't be, and shit like that can't be practiced as much. Granted, that's more banks, but I need to look up more redlining now that I said that out loud. Put something in the comments. Tell me I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. That's fine, I don't care. An executive order pushing federal agencies to regularly and meaningfully engage with tribal governments. Okay, sweet. I don't know what they mean by meaningfully engage, but okay. I'm assuming it's going to be like Native American tribal governments, which is fine, but I don't know what they mean by meaningfully engage. Whatever. Number 4, an executive memorandum directing the Health and Human Services Department and Biden's COVID Health Equity Task Force to consider issuing best practices for advancing, quote, cultural competency, unquote, and sensitivity toward Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders as part of its COVID response efforts. The memo also directs the Department of Justice to partner with those communities to prevent hate crimes and harassment against them. This is good, because you don't need more xenophobia exposing itself. Just because they had reports of it starting in China doesn't mean it's a Chinese virus. Viruses don't really discriminate. In this case, humans and 2 of the gorillas at the safari park up in Escondido, but it doesn't matter. And this is targeted. This has made it so a lot of bigoted people have targeted people who are Asian. Not even specifically Chinese. I don't know the amount of white people or xenophobes that can identify between Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Lao, and Pacific Islanders, to be quite frank. Hell, even many Asians have trouble doing that. Point being, Trump has used a giant dog whistle of calling it the Chinese virus, which has targeted Asian Americans. That's what you do. That's what it does when you use very bigoted language on a platform as the leader of the free world, of the developed world, whatever you want to call it. Too many Americans' families, systemic racism and inequality in our economy, laws and institutions still put the American dreams far out of reach. Now, laws and institutions, you're not going to have explicit like, oh, black people can't do this. It's not Jim Crow. There are implicit laws that are put into place and laws that have the racially systemic outcome. As I said in my last video, there was in Georgia, I believe, in their Supreme Court, there was Republican legislation that they tried to pass in the state of Georgia that was ultimately shot down because their Supreme Court ultimately determined that it was systemically racist in practice because it would have suppressed the minority vote, mainly of black people. Crazy. It's like when Republicans don't have black people on their side, they're going to lose, and they don't want to lose. They believe in freedom, but they don't actually fight for it. Anyway, building a more equitable economy is essential if Americans are going to competitive... Oh, this is Susan Rice saying this stuff, by the way. Domestic policy advisor Susan Rice. Noted the briefings that... Yeah, so as I stated before, the briefing that Biden's order to the Department of Justice, it doesn't apply to private prison contracts with other agencies such as ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That order is, quote, silent on what may or may not transpire with ICE facilities, unquote. So they're trying to figure out what to do with that, basically. So it's just the beginning. These are just the beginning of racial equity push. So this is good, overall. Because we're not going to pretend that racism just doesn't exist. If we ignore it, it won't exist. That's not how it works. We just had the presidency of Donald Trump where racists came out of the woodwork. But whatever. Oh, CNBC. Okay, I'm gonna. Oh, if you want to look at this article, by the way, I'm gonna put it in the description. But Biden put, according to the article, he put racial justice issues at the center of his winning campaign against former President Donald Trump. This is don't give him too much credit, CNBC. He had to have more people fighting for Joe Biden than he fought for himself. Don't give Joe Biden too much credit. Like, people were phone banking that didn't like Joe Biden. I was advocating for Joe Biden. I don't like the dude at all. He sucks, even though I'm giving him credit right now. So shortly after being sworn into office, Biden signed an executive order that established his administration's social justice focus and revoked some of his predecessor's policies. Thank goodness, because his policies were incredibly xenophobic, incredibly bigoted. Like I mentioned last video, he overturned Trump's ban on trans people joining the military. I don't. You're fighting for your country. Why can't you just fight for your country no matter how you identify? This is like the don't ask, don't tell stuff in the military years ago. Like, this is fucking dumb. There's been millions of people who have died for their country who identify differently than heterosexuals and people who are cisgendered. Like, who the fuck cares? Biden also ended the Trump administration's 1776 commission, which is ahistorical and highly racist, and which, quote, produced a report highly critical of progressive ideologies in the final days of Trump's term, unquote. Yeah, good. Because the 1776 commission, from what I've looked at, is just highly ahistorical, not accurate to what has been historically documented. I'm not surprised, because with Trump's administration, there was ahistorical revisionism just to get their ideologies in practice, and they would use those as talking points, even though the history behind it was not at all accurate. And yet the one thing he'll make accurate is like, oh, Biden wrote the crime bill. He did write the crime bill. That's one truth that Trump had. Let's see. Biden's order put the Domestic Policy Council, led by Rice, in charge of coordinating efforts, quote, efforts to end equity principles, policies. I don't know why I had trouble reading that. Policies and approaches across federal government. This will include efforts to remove systemic barriers and to provide equal access to opportunities and benefits, identify communities the federal government has unserved, and develop policies designed to advance equity for those communities. Okay, I want to see more of these plans in place and how they're going to do that. It just seems like a lot of virtue signaling, other than these executive orders. But what Rice is saying seems like a lot of virtue signaling. So, if they get this into practice, this is great. But the biggest thing that I got from this is ending private prison contracts. This is awesome. Prison shouldn't be part of the free market. Like I said, they are the ones that are anti-marijuana. They lobby for that on purpose. I wonder why, because they can get more prisoners. And then that's more slave labor for them, essentially. I mean, it would be... Well, there were articles talking about how prisoners would be on the front lines when fires were happening. I think this happened in California, maybe? I gotta double check that. But that's just kind of like if someone was taken... The analogy that Vosh put, Vosh Vidya, if you haven't checked out his stuff, the way that he put it was, it's like the people who were taken prisoner during war. They were prisoners of war, and then during the next battle, they'd be taken on the front line, so that way if there were any casualties, it wouldn't be their own. It's not to say that all prisoners are good people. Obviously not, but non-violent drug offenses aren't bad things. They're just against the law, I guess, to do non-violent drug offenses, like an unnecessary law, to be honest. If Biden ends the drug war, this would do so much more for racial equality, especially looking at the groups that are systemically targeted. Well, maybe not intentionally targeted, but they are targeted. Usually it's intentional, but I'm not going to get into that. If you ended the drug war, this would be awesome. Let out the non-violent drug offenders. I mean, he should be for legalizing marijuana. But as far as I know, he's not, even though he had a, quote, progressive platform, which was actually pushed more to the left by Bernie Sanders during his, his during the primaries. So that forced Joe Biden to have to change his platform, but he was still against marijuana legalization. I don't know the fuck why. So, yeah, this is great. I love this information. I'm glad he's going to end the private prison contracts. At least that's the hope. It's like healthcare. This should not be on the free market at all. Considering that private prisons go to the lowest common denominator, so there's been reports of private prisons having food with maggots in it. They don't go very high for the well-being of their prisoners. I mean, I know they pay for labor for like security and that stuff, but they're making a lot more money just by distributing that free labor that they get. So, objectively, private prisons are terrible. And I'm glad Joe Biden did this. I hope there's more good news to come. I'm sure I'm going to criticize him soon. Like I said, Joe Biden's been pretty hawkish in terms of foreign policy. But yeah, we'll see what happens. In the meantime, good job, Joe.